Hey everybody, I am not a member of the LGBTQ plus community, but I listen to my friends who are, and what they tell me universally is that their safety concerns are different from those who are not a member of that community. And the best thing we can do as allies is to listen to what they have to say and help them make themselves safe. With us today is Myriam Dumont, who is a librarian, educator, and advocate for LGBTQ plus families. So let's go listen to what she has to say. Thank you very much for watching today. Please do hit the like or subscribe button. Follow us on Facebook. Check out the Patreon. Now, let's get to work. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and with me today is Myriam. Hello, Myriam.
Hi, Jason.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Myriam Dumont is a queer elementary school teacher librarian in North Vancouver, BC, Canada. She's been teaching since 2008 and graduated from the University of British Columbia with her master's in society, culture, and politics in education in 2010. She's also a sexual health educator and did her training with Options for Sexual Health. She's passionate about LGBTQ plus education in schools and has helped implement policy, create resources and workshops for teachers to help make schools safer places for marginalized children and families. She also enjoys mentoring young queer teachers about how to enter the school system. She was born and raised in Vancouver, currently lives in East Vancouver with her two incredible kids, ages 5 and 8. And she also started the Facebook group Queer Families of Vancouver back in 2013 when her first kid was born. The group started, I talk good. I know I talk good. The group started off small, but now has over 800 members. So welcome, Myriam. Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thanks, Jason.
And Myriam, who is an educator for LGBTQ plus people and an advocate and an educator in the school system to help people address the needs of this community, has volunteered to come onto the show today and talk about how we, as either parents of children who are identifying in that community, maybe wondering whether they're identifying with that community, can live safer, healthier lives because of some of the unique dangers to members of the LGBTQ community. And also how, if we aren't ourselves part of that community, how we can be better allies to our children's friends or in our positions of authority and power within the education system. So I think my first question is, what's the thing you see most often in school, the biggest challenge for children in this community?
Well, I think, there are very unique challenges to kids who are identifying or think that they might identify as members of the LGBTQ community when they're older, teenagers. One of the things that I often talk about is how for a lot of marginalized youth, like, youth of color or youth, for example, if you're a kid who's Muslim, from a Muslim family, you will or could be often bullied at school or discriminated against at school because of that identity. But at least you go home and there is some sense often of security, at least in your home, that your identity is being, valued and celebrated at your home. Whereas for a lot of like queer youth and children, homes aren't safe spaces. And then, sometimes schools aren't either. So schools can really serve as this place for youth to feel like safer places where their identities are valued and celebrated and recognized as great, And I think so in that sense, the challenges can be a little bit different than, say, for example, kids who are from queer families like my own family, right? So the challenges that our kids can face aren't necessarily that their identities and their family aren't being celebrated at home, but they might go to school and they're, feel like they're being discriminated against or bullied for, having a queer family, having two moms, having two dads, having parents who are transgender, etc.
And it seems to me that and again, I'm an outsider looking in, so there's a lot of stuff I'm guessing that I don't know.
Right.
But that at school, the trouble seems to come from three very different camps, and the least common one is, actual bigots.
Right. Yeah.
Where in the middle there's people who mean well, but aren't yet equipped.
Right.
And then, unfortunately, the third category is teachers in administration who either
Yeah.
themselves have maybe outmoded ideas or just aren't willing to accept that it's there and treat it like other kinds of bullying, which unfortunately in many schools is a kids will be kids as part of growing up vibe,
Right.
rather than addressing it head on and making sure the school is a safe sense. So, I mean, the solution for the bullies is, fire. But
Mm-hmm.
I think the largest one that most of it is that middle ground of people who, and I'm sure that I've been part of this camp myself, who mean well, but don't know how and
Right.
create a hostile environment
Right.
accidentally. What are some of the things first that if you're growing up LGBTQ, what are some of the best resources that you can access? And then we'll
Right.
talk about what we can do to make it a better place all around.
Well, I think youth, have I've listened to panels of youth before, queer youth, talking about what things are most helpful for them.
Mhm.
And I have to say that representation, so seeing themselves, whether it's in literature or the teachers who are teaching them, have immense value for their self-esteem and their sense of safety. So, this is why I often, or really encourage teachers who are part of the LGBTQ plus community to be out if they feel like it's safe to do so, because, even friends of mine who are now in their 40s and 50s who remember having just that one teacher who was a safe person for them made a huge impact on their high school days. And we know that kids can't learn and kids can't do anything productive of schools if they don't feel safe. And so having teachers, whether those teachers identify as LGBTQ or those teachers are very clearly safe allies for those kids is huge. I think teachers making the leap to feel, even if they're a little bit uncomfortable and even if they're unsure of, the terminology or the proper things to do, but at least showing that they're willing to learn, maybe, having books available in their classrooms that have LGBTQ characters that are written by LGBTQ authors is also a really clear signal to youth. Even things like, we've seen a huge increase in the way kids feel safe just when they see that rainbow sticker on a teacher's door or they see the rainbow sticker at the office, right? It's something very, very small, seemingly small, but it signals to them and kids like my kids who are part of a queer family who don't identify as queer, and might down the road, but for now don't. So although they are not queer, their family is queer. And so for them, that's huge. Like they see themselves, being in a safe place when they see something like that sticker.
So any kind of quiet leading by example, it sounds like, is a great way for an adult in a
Yeah,
school to
I
help.
think quiet and also not so quiet, right? Like I have this story that I love to tell about a friend of mine who's now in their 40s who, in a grade 9, I think it was his math classroom, and he was not out at all during high school. He didn't feel safe. He was from a small town in Eastern Canada, and it wasn't safe for him to be out. But, he heard a student in math class one day calling another student, a derogatory gay term. And the teacher just looked up and said, "Get out of my class. You can't use that kind of language in my class." And he talked about how that moment was extremely pivotal for him in terms of knowing that teacher and that class was a safe place for him. He doesn't remember what he learned in math and he couldn't tell you what he did that year, but that moment really stuck out for him as that teacher being a safe person. And, would I recommend that as a technique now in educating kids about, terminology, et cetera? No, but I do think that's a very powerful stance to take as a teacher, to say, I'm not going to be tolerating, that kind of bigotry, those kind of terms, that kind of, those kind of things in my classroom.
Sounds like that zero tolerance term, which became a buzzword and turned out to have just
Right.
terrible repercussions and results.
Yeah.
Certainly applies, I think, as a teacher or an adult volunteering about if you hear something like that, to immediately just nope, that doesn't fly, not here.
Yeah,
And
like I think about it in terms of safer, like we know that there isn't really such a thing as a safe place, because ultimately places are safer for different kinds of youth. But if it's safer for, queer youth, if it's safer for racialized youth, if we've made it really clear that we're not going to be tolerating bigotry, racism, homophobia, it's not going to feel super safe for those kids who have learned that that's okay, that that's an acceptable worldview. So in fact, there is no the idea of a safe place for every kid, I think is a little bit of a myth. I think what we're doing is creating a safer place in our schools, challenging those different types of oppression that are rampant in our society, and saying that this is not going to be a safe place for you to express your bigotry, for you to enact these different types of like subtle, not so subtle violences. And so you kind of have to decide, like, who is the space safe for?
well, that makes good sense. And we're talking a lot about what adults can do in the classroom. Right. And real quick, I wanted to do a shameless plug for an earlier episode with Dave Kovar on how teens and tweens can handle bullying.
Right.
Both in terms of being bullied and being the one to stand up and say, not on my watch.
Right.
To another bully. For any teens who are watching the show who want to know what they can personally do to create a safer space for their LGBTQ friends.
Well, and I just have to say, like, my mind often, when I see videos of, and they're horrific, of a teen getting assaulted or bullied in a classroom, or, there's one recently that surfaced in a town near us of a transgender youth, getting assaulted outside by two girls. It's horrific. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, why is nobody else intervening? Yeah. Because we know that consistently happens. But what I do with my kids is often talk about, like, what is your role as a bystander, right? So for me, the most shocking thing of that is that somebody is watching and filming it, which means somebody's there witnessing it, but nobody on the outside is doing anything about it. And I think we see that a lot in schools. We see teachers not intervening, we see youth not intervening, and that's actually the biggest conversation we need to be having with our kids right now. Is it's your responsibility when you see somebody getting hurt, to step in and use your power and your privilege to stop it, right?
One of the better techniques that I've learned about that is, if you're not a fighter, right, to early, as you see bullying happen, just walk right in the middle, completely oblivious to the bullying people, take the person around the arms and hey, I need to show you something over here. Did you see the thing in the library? And just walk out, completely ignoring that person before it comes up. It's a very good technique for people who aren't comfortable with the confrontation, who don't feel confident with their physical abilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you had brought up something that I think is very important to address, which is that sometimes the staff doesn't intervene. Sometimes the administration isn't receptive to parents when they call and say, my child's being bullied. What are some of the best things that parents can do if they're in that situation?
Well, there's kind of different levels. Like we've come a pretty long way here in BC. So what's what I see the first level of protection for, queer youth, queer families, is that there needs to be policy in place. Policy doesn't ensure that bullying isn't going to happen, because, as I mentioned, we just had a case recently. But what we did, and it took time, was we mobilized in our province to have policy for every single school board. So every single school board, whether you're in Vancouver, which is a very progressive school board, to, maybe a not so progressive school board in more kind of rural religious communities, to up north, they all have policies that are aimed to protect LGBTQ students and families. Because I think once you have policy, once you've mobilized and implemented that policy, every time something happens, you can go back to that policy and say, wait a minute, in the policy, you've told us that, X, Y, Z, and that's not happening. So that's kind of the first line of defense, I think, that needs to happen. And it often is a very long and tedious process that can take years. But what we found is as more and more school boards in the province started having these, school boards couldn't say no because all the school boards around them had them, right? And of course, some school boards have really strong policy that includes implementation of curriculum and resources, some not so strong, but it's a starting point. And then the next level for sure is education, professional development for teachers. I think I just held a workshop for teacher librarians. In BC, we're calling LGBTQ education. We have a term now. It's called SOGI 123. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity. So I hosted a workshop, and I had people saying, I really want to do this, but I feel nervous, and it's great that I'm protected by the policy now. I'm still worried about my parent community. So there is this I do think this huge group of individuals who are wanting to do it and know that it's important and see the value in it, but are still really hesitant or nervous to kind of embark on the journey because it feels maybe a little bit overwhelming or unfamiliar to them. And what I say to those teachers is, of course it feels nerve-wracking and unfamiliar, and that in itself is okay. So, for me as a white person, I do a lot of anti-racism education with my students, and I've been doing it for over 10 years, and I still feel really uncomfortable and nervous, and it's important for me to do it, right? And it's the same when I'm doing education, when I'm talking about ableism, when I'm talking about folks with disabilities. I struggle, it's uncomfortable, and yet it's so incredibly important. And I think what I'm doing to my students is modeling that, what it's like to be an ally for those communities. And so, we're using the terms, we're using the words, we're talking about what it means, and it might not be perfect. And often I look back at lessons that I did, even last year and think, oh my gosh, I could have done that so much better. But it's not about being perfect and, for it to, that there's only one way to do LGBTQ, education. It's that you're opening up dialogue, you're trying your best, and you're showing kids that it's okay to constantly be learning. Like, we're all in a process of learning as adults. And I think, the other piece to that is that I often say that the most important type of education is education that is really hard and that's really challenging for us as communities, right? So if I'm teaching books, if I'm providing kind of just the status quo in my library, like as a teacher librarian, and not ruffling any feathers and making everyone happy, that's fine, but I'm actually not doing super important work. I think that the really important work is when you are rocking the boat a little bit, because what you're doing is pushing people's boundaries. And that's when social change happens, right? Social change isn't easy. It's not free of messiness. It's hard, and it rattles people's kind of values and beliefs and challenges people. But I think that's our jobs as educators, right? Because our students are telling us that they want that. And so I don't think it's our job to appease everybody and to make everybody happy. And it would be really interesting, I think, for teachers and educators to start seeing education, to start kind of normalizing that, to feeling comfortable with that, to saying, okay, I have a parent who's coming to talk to me because they're upset about that. Well, that's actually great. That means the work I'm doing is kind of shaking things up in this community a little bit, right? Instead of really being nervous or opposed to that. But I do think that takes, kind of years of being an educator, and you have to feel comfortable doing that, right?
And it takes an administration and a school board who will back you up.
Absolutely, right. And I think, I know the climate in the States is different than in Canada. Just like I said, the climate, our political climate in Vancouver and even in East Vancouver is very different than in our suburbs. And so it's easier to do in some places than others. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm based in what we like to call the People's Republic of Oregon. So
Right.
it's yeah, west of the Cascades. It's a very liberal area.
Right.
But in some of those other parts of the country, whether it's Canada or America or anywhere else, if you're in a district that doesn't have that policy, you know,
Right.
the specific process will have some difference in the technicalities, but who's the first person that I should call to
I
get
mean,
that ball rolling?
do you mean as a parent? Do you mean as a teacher?
I think as a parent, you know,
Yeah.
teachers kind of know they know the labyrinth already.
Hmm.
Where a parent who's an outsider who's looking at that and it's a district that doesn't yet have policy, or maybe it has policy but they're not training their staff. Where do I start the process of getting that policy and that curriculum and that training
Right.
rolling?
I mean, the thing with parents is that they have immense power, and I think they sometimes forget. I mean, also sometimes we're exhausted and don't have the energy for it. But I think we forget that a lot of the big changes that have happened in schools are
Mhm.
because of parents mobilizing, right? And that often teachers feel like they can only do so much. But it's the parents pushing back and going, no, we want this, we demand this, right? We've seen this in Vancouver with parent groups who have said, you are not doing enough anti-racism education in our schools. Our kids are suffering, we want this. It's the parents that brought, the things that we now have forward. Same with issues like SOGI issues, right?
Mhm.
So I think the parents often the some of the loudest parents are parents who are discontent about certain things. So we can see a really small group of parents, when we were implementing or doing policy changes, for example, at the Vancouver School Board a couple of years ago, when we revised our existing policy, we had a very small group of extremely loud parents who were against what we were doing, who got a lot of media attention. But in fact, it was a really, really small group of people. Luckily, what happened were parents who wanted it were also very vocal, and there was way more support for the revision of the policy. And so I think that the parents who are wanting that in their schools, the parents who are wanting policy, who are wanting, anti-racism education done, need to be, just as vocal as the folks who aren't for it, and kind of need to mobilize and start going to the school board and saying, how are you protecting, our students? And how are you ensuring that they feel safe? What do you have in place? Because we don't see policy right now. We don't see any actions. There's schools where kids don't feel safe going to the washrooms. So my kids' basic needs aren't being met. They're coming home and they're in tears. And, it's the safety piece, I think. It's I know that parent groups who have gone to the media and who have said, and that's one way, but I think parents, it's our job as parents to ensure that our kids are safe. And we do have a lot of power. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of mobilizing, right?
Absolutely. One thing it sounds like you're saying is that I would have thought that the first call would be to the school board or the administration, but the first call needs to be to the families we know are like-minded and would also like to see that policy in place, so we can approach the school board with a group of people showing not just our family but a community support for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I
Mhm.
think it depends how much energy you have. I think it
Mhm.
depends on what you want your end goal to be. I think it
Mhm.
depends on whether or not you want allies, whether or not you want straight allies who are with you, who are saying, you know what, our family isn't a queer family, or our kids don't identify as LGBTQ, and we want this as well, right? And the place of the allies in this is extremely important, as it was, when we were implementing, for example, or wanting stronger anti-racism policy. It's like, it's not just actually folks of color who want this. Is the white people are also saying, white folks are saying, we need stronger anti-racism education in our schools, right? So I think it's the same for LGBTQ issues, is, all families coming forward, backing people up, because, allies in this situation, and most of the time have a lot of power, because it's not seen as like a special interest issue or something that just, oh, we have so few queer kids in our school, we have so few queer families, so why create all this just for those families? It's the admin and the school board is seeing that actually the entire parent community is wanting this, right?
That makes sense, because often administration will ignore one family.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I think, human nature sometimes to look askance at somebody who's advocating for a position that affects them personally.
Right.
Right. But if you're an ally and your family is not queer, but you're also standing behind them, it's harder for them to ignore that or treat it with less respect than it deserves.
Well, and if administration is seeing that a lot of families are supportive, and like we were talking about, maybe administration is wanting to do something, but has these ideas that they're going to come up against a lot of backlash and issues, and which might be the case, but it's also their job to kind of back up why why they have certain policy or why they're implementing XYZ in the schools. But if they can feel like there's a large amount of families that want this, or people are asking for it, then it shows them that it's an important thing for sure. But there will be some places where it might just be a handful of families, and that's really, really hard. That's really challenging for those families.
I think that's another great topic to bring up. If you are a family that are in one of those communities that is not as friendly, I mean, I feel like most of society, including those more rural, more religious areas, we've moved leaps and bounds beyond the 80s but there's still a long way to go. If you are in that kind of community and maybe you feel unsafe publicly even coming out, I mean, other than moving, because you're not going to volunteer to stay there. There's things that are keeping you there. Right. What can you do for your kids and your family in that kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think people, queer families who I know who are living in kind of more remote areas, or where they're the only queer families they know, I think it's very challenging for sure. And I think they find a little bit of solace or community in like online community groups. It's of course harder with COVID now because people can't meet up. I found during Pride, you'd see a lot of families coming for the different events in Vancouver from, around the province. And that was kind of their time of the year to, that they got really excited about. But I think it's hard because safety is your number one priority. So if it's not safe for your kid to be out and be their authentic self, that's really tricky, I think, as a parent. And if you're a queer family, you can't, most of the time you can't really hide that you're a queer family. Although I also have some friends who find ways. So it is tricky. And I'm not sure, to be honest, if there's like a solution. I think it can be a really hard and isolating life. And those communities need our support immensely. And it can be really challenging. Like at that workshop I was telling you about with teacher librarians, even in BC, Canada, that I think is known to be quite progressive around the world. We have some teacher librarians who have been told, not to have certain books on their shelves. So it's hard because it feels like in some areas we're making so much progress. And then when I hear things like that, we're just reminded that there's still a lot of places where things are very, very slow and where life is really hard for marginalized youth, for sure.
Now, you mentioned something specific that I think is probably important, where because we live in this connected age, where if you are a queer family in a situation where you do feel very isolated and alone, seeing that there are allies and friends and a larger, more vibrant world is literally your computer away. And now, there's much more queer representation in books and movies now than there ever were.
Yeah.
And since you're a librarian, what are some books you would recommend that librarians carry, or that we just pass on to somebody who's maybe living in that situation?
I mean, I have about 1 million, so how much time do you have? I could send you a book list. I mean, I specialize in kindergarten to grade 7, so kind of ages 13 and under. There's a lot of great picture books. I tell schools and teacher librarians to to find picture books, you know, we used to have picture books that we would read in terms of, for example, families. So if we were teaching kindergarten kids, grade 2 kids about all different types of families, and then we'd have our one book or two books featuring, you know, 2 moms or 2 dads. And now the great thing is we just have stories that have 2 moms or 2 dads in them. So I don't need to pick up a book and read a story about how some people have 2 moms, and that's just the story. And it's incredibly boring, quite frankly. And instead I have a story where there's a great plot line and awesome pictures, and in it, the kid just happens to have 2 moms, right? So kind of normalizing that, and, you know, same with, you know, having LGBTQ protagonists, or, you know, a kid who uses the they pronoun, just things like that that are just normalized within the stories. And I think, you know, the genre, the kind of middle school genre, I think that's right before the YA genre, grades like 4 to 7, has so many great books that have come out, whether it's like, you know, about, there was one last year by a Canadian author, I can't remember, My Life is a Diamond, which is about a trans boy who moves to Seattle, and he's in a baseball league and he has all these great friends, but he's really nervous that they're going to find out that he's trans, and he's worried about how they're going to react. And it's a great book. It's totally age appropriate for the kind of grades 4 to 7 age range. And there's so much in there about friendship and empathy and being a good friend, and worrying that your friends won't like you, that, you know, all kids can relate to, which, you know, we didn't have that even 15 years ago. So there are just so many great books. And often I'll just once in a while Google, you know, new middle school novels for, with LGBTQ protagonists, for example. And, you know, there'll be a whole brand new book list. I find that there's so many book lists out there. So they're fairly easy to find, and I think they're great resources to have for kids. And I find that the kids who take them out in my library aren't necessarily kids who identify as LGBTQ+, but are kids who are really interested in learning about what it's like for those kids, and can also just relate to the, you know, the preteen angst of, you know, feeling a little bit different, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
And that reading list, that keeping it at home, I think that's an important thing. Not keeping it at home. That was a terrible use of words for this situation. But starting it at home. One of the through lines for so many of the interviews I've done about bullying, about internet safety, about suicide prevention is the home front. Keeping it warm and safe and loving with open communication. And I think one of the things there is, right now, somebody who's watching the show, well, not right now, because, you know, we record about a month before we go off, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Somebody is watching the show, and sometime in the next month or two, their kid's going to come out to them.
Right.
And, you know, we have our instincts, which are to love and protect our children.
Yeah.
But as you know from a professional who trains people, instincts are great, but instincts with skills is much, much better. What are some things that we can know and train about, and skills we can develop, so that if I'm the person who's having that conversation a month from now, I can do that conversation as well as I possibly can?
That's a great question. Yeah. You know, when I teach sexual health, and I teach teachers how to teach sexual health. And one of the things I tell them to practice is their facial expressions, right? Because which is of course challenging with our mask wearing right now. But, you know, I say, especially younger kids and even teenagers, they see right through us. Like if you're talking about body parts and you're really nervous, because I mean, who isn't, right? Because most of us haven't had great sex ed when we were growing up. So it's going to feel awkward for most of us. If you're talking about body parts, and it's the first time kids have heard these words, and the first time kids have gotten sexual health education, and you're nervous, they're going to see that on your face. And actually, little kids don't really differentiate between nervousness and anxiety and anger. So you're talking about sexual health, you're trying to be a safe person, you're doing the best job you can, and they're watching you and going, oh, is she angry right now? And then they're associating you're talking about body parts and you're talking about consent, but you've got this angry look on your face. And, you know, when I read about that study, I thought, oh, it's so interesting, because I see this as so many things that we can talk to kids about where we have our own insecurities. And so what I tell to people is practice in front of a mirror, right? So what's your reaction going to be if your kid comes out? Well, practice in front of a mirror what you're going to say and how that's going to feel. And you'd be surprised, I think, at the feelings that your facial expression and your body language gives away, even if the words you're saying are words that you think are, you know, kind, compassionate words. So that's kind of the first thing is, you know, it seems silly, but practice it. Like, imagine your kids coming out to you, right? And then the other thing is, there's this great kids book that's actually older called Teddy, My Friendship with Teddy, or something like that. And it's basically about a teddy bear who wants to tell their friend that actually, you know, they were born a boy and they have a boy name, but actually they've always felt like a girl. I think it's that way. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But what I love about the story is the way that the friend receives it. The friend, like, you know, the Teddy's getting so worked up and nervous about telling their friend. Teddy comes out to their friend and the friend goes, oh, okay, that's fine by me. And then the story just moves on and they have a tea party, right? And I just think it's one of my favorite books because of how much of a non-issue it is, because I mean, that is frankly the way it is for kids, right? So for adults, it's more loaded and we have all these preconceived notion of what's my kid's life going to be if they're LGBTQ? What does this mean for us as a family, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a really beautiful way to just illustrate how you can receive that information and receive it just in a way that's like, okay, yeah, I respect you and that's who you are. And that's great. You know, I think conversations with parents, of course, are going to be more complex, but I think what every youth needs to and wants to hear is, okay, like, I love you and I respect you and that's what you want. And I'm here to support you. You know, we have like some great examples of parents who've been like, great, let's throw you a party. And, you know, for parents who maybe are struggling a little bit more with that, you know, and it's like, you don't have to throw a party to be supportive of you know, your LGBTQ teen or child, but you do, I think, you know, they're looking for you for reassurance that it's okay, because that's all kids want, right? Is to know that they're unconditionally loved by their parents. So that's our job, to say, that's fine. Yeah, I respect you. I love you. And then in terms of, you know, trying to understand it and move forward if it's challenging for you, you know, reaching out to groups like PFLAG, for example, right? PFLAG is a great, so PFLAG is Parents and Families, PFLAG for Lesbian and Gay Youth. That's the acronym, PFLAG. And there's PFLAG chapters all over the world, right? And so my recommendation is always, you know, you don't look to your child to support you through maybe your grief and your, you know, challenges around them coming out to you. You go to adults for that, to debrief that. You go to, you know, a counselor, or you go to a PFLAG, to other parents who have had challenges who can support you. But, you know, the only thing your child needs to see from you is, even if it's struggled, that you still love them and you're going to learn and you're going to be that parent to them that loves them unconditionally.
I want to underline what you said about, and you're going to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very, very difficult for many parents to step down from that omnipotent, omniscient figure that their 4-year-old thought they were.
Right.
And to just openly say, you know, I love you unconditionally. You've met my parents.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do this. This is going to be a little hard for me, but I love you and I'm going to learn with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a safe place for you, right? It's that thing again of, you know, if they're coming out to you, it's taken them a long time to kind of go think about that. It's an extremely brave thing for them to do. And then to know, you know, they might struggle at school, but at least at home, you'll be okay about that. And you're going to talk, and you're going to, again, you know, tying it to what I was telling you about when I do anti-racism work and how it can be quite uncomfortable for me. Well, you're still going to use those words. You're going to be okay with it. And maybe you're going to practice in the mirror saying gay 100 times so that when you say it, you're not awkward around your teen, right? Or you're going to use the term that they identify with, or you're going to ask them if they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And if you struggle with that, then you're going to practice in the mirror a zillion times, right? But it is your job as a parent, I think, to create a safe place at home, because ultimately we want them coming to us with any issues they have. And if they feel worried or scared that you're not the safe person, then that's not going to happen. And learning is okay. Like it's okay to admit that we're not 100% all knowing or comfortable or, going to be perfect in all of this. But they do need to know that we love them. Yeah.
Sounds like maybe some warm-up conversations throughout life, because not just in this situation, but also protecting our kids from predators, protecting our kids from any number of things. Internet safety starts with having frank, honest, non-fraught conversations about sex and sexuality very early.
Right.
And that's some warm-up rounds basically for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have had several people in my life tell me that they thought the conversation coming out to their parents was going to go very differently than it did. And I often think, that it actually went really well. And their parents, it was kind of a thing of like, okay, I don't really know any gay people, but like, I love you. And, 20 years later, it's a non-issue. But I often think, oh, I wonder, like, it took you so long to come out to your mom because you thought your mom, might not love you or whatever. And if your mom had made that clear from the time you were very little, that no matter, what your identity was, she would love you, that whole process would have saved you a lot of time and grief, right? And anxiety. And so even that in itself, kids knowing at a very young age that, you will decide when you're older, how you identify. And regardless of how you identify, I will always love you, just them knowing that. So if they ever need to have that conversation, then they feel comfortable doing so. But if you've never, it's that thing of never talking about an issue actually sends a very strong signal, right? So you might not be homophobic and transphobic, and you might not be using slurs and saying terrible things in your household. But if you never talk about those identities, that's sending a pretty strong signal, I think, to your kids, right? That it's a little bit taboo, or there's something wrong, or you feel uncomfortable, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of the same with sexual health, right? It's if we never talk to our kids about anything like that, well, they're gonna, get the very not so subtle message that, it's not okay. I can't talk to you about that kind of stuff.
I mean, we live in a society, both in Canada and America, where you can watch a murder on TV, but you can't see a boob.
Yeah.
And a lot of us are squicked out about talking about sex with our kids and the idea of our kids having sex. But I think as parents, one of our jobs, starting with changing that terrible diaper, is getting over what squicks us out and doing the hard thing to make it easier on our kids.
I'm going to plug a really great program that I actually think every parent should take. And because of COVID now, it's happening online, which is great. So it is a BC program through an organization called, and maybe I can send you the link after and you can post it, right?
That'd be great. I'll put it right in the show notes.
Okay, great. So the organization is called Options for Sexual Health, and they do a lot of great work in BC, including, they have clinics for youth and for adults. They provide contraception, things like that. But one of the amazing things they also do is they have a sexual health educator program. Now, that in itself is a year-long program that is quite comprehensive. I think it's the only one of its kind, at least in Canada. But prior to that, you have to have a few prerequisites. And one of the things that they offer is something called a SAR, which is, the acronym is SAR, and it stands for Sexual Attitudes Reassessment Workshop. It's a weekend-long workshop where, what they do for adults is they go through a whole number of issues around sexuality. And the goal is not for you to come out of it feeling like, oh, I'm comfortable with everything. And, like none of this is problematic to me. And, look at how progressive I am. And, that's not the piece. The piece I think is actually for you to reevaluate and look at your attitudes towards certain issues, and then to be aware of that. And I think that's a really important thing, because it doesn't mean you have to feel comfortable with everything under the umbrella of sexuality. But I think it is really important as educators and as a parent to know where your views and your values stand and what makes you feel uncomfortable. Because again, then when those issues come up with our kids, at least we can know, okay, I don't have a lot of knowledge around this, or I feel uncomfortable, but here's some great resources, right? Or, to know, because sometimes we don't even realize how uncomfortable or how much our bias is affecting the way we're teaching or parenting our own children, right? And how much that has an influence on that.
Yeah, being aware of your blind spots and weaknesses.
Exactly, that's all
whatever
it is.
It is.
Yeah, and SARs are offered all around the world. I'm sure there's a great organization in Portland that runs them as well. Mm-hmm. But it really is, I think, an amazing thing for a parent, especially as their kid is getting older, to kind of delve into and to go, oh, okay, like if I feel really nervous talking about contraception, etc. So either if I don't feel like I can do that for my own child, I'm going to have to give them some really great resources. Otherwise, they're going to find out the information on their own. And as we know, that can be extremely problematic.
We talked earlier about some of the advantages of being in this connected world. The disadvantage is your kids are going to learn it from somewhere. And some of the places they can learn it are at best problematic and at worst actively predatory.
Yeah, like I was telling my kid the other day when we were in a bookstore, I said, and she's almost 8. And I said to her, this is the bookstore. I used to skip school, and I would take the bus, and I would come to this bookstore, and I would go down this aisle, because this is where all the books on bodies and sexual health were. And I would sit there as a teenager and I'd read them. So that's kind of best case scenario, because at least I was getting information from actual books. But I was so desperate for the knowledge and I wasn't getting it anywhere else. And of course she was like, you skipped school? And that was her main focus on the conversation. But I think, that's best case scenario, but most kids aren't doing that, especially now. Like they're going on the internet. And the unfortunate thing is we actually have amazing, great resources now for teens and for kids that are really easily accessible, including actually, and this will be in my other plug, through Options for Sexual Health, there's something called the Sex Sense line where kids and teenagers can call. It's open every day and ask any question they want to do sexual health. And it's a nurse or a sexual health educator on the other line, right? So it's a pretty amazing resource. It's like, I know parents who call it when their kids ask them questions and they're not sure how to answer the questions. It's an amazing thing. So it's just getting the word out and having kids and families access that. Yeah.
And that it does remind me of a famous quote from my great grandfather, who would sometimes say, I don't know, but in a little bit we'll both know.
Yeah. Right? Or we in education, there's actually a children's book for growth mindset, and we and it's called I don't know ... yet. The idea that like I don't know and I'm still learning and I'll eventually know. Like I'm working on it, right? Yeah.
Well, Myriam, I want to thank you so much again for coming on. But before we go, you've been around the block a few times. You've taught people, you've spoken. This is not the first interview you've conducted, I can tell. What is the question that I should have asked you that I haven't?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think we talked a lot about, okay, maybe the thing I'll talk about is, and we went over it a little bit, but it's the idea of of allyship, right? Within any kind of community. And I think often people are worried about saying the wrong thing, or, you know, people who are coming from a really great place who want to kind of help and work alongside folks. And I think not everyone, but the majority of people really not only appreciate allyship, but need folks to step up, because you know, in this particular situation, LGBTQ education is easier for allies to do, because there's not this sense that they have a hidden agenda. Like, it's extremely powerful when we have straight identifying teachers in our school doing this work. And are they doing it perfectly? No, but none of us are doing it perfectly. But they're demonstrating to kids, and it's extremely powerful for our kids, you know, that no, actually, I'm not part of that community, and this work's really important, right? And and here's what it looks like to be an ally. And so I think that piece is really important. In the same way that it's a lot easier for me to do anti-racism education as a white person, right? That it is for a teacher of color to go, you know, to stand in front of the class and to do that kind of education. And so that would be my little plug for you know, for allyship, and that, you know, don't be stuck on it being uncomfortable or being nervous about saying the wrong thing. I think your intentions and your willingness to constantly learn is actually the most important thing.
And there's a bit of a metaphor again from more like security mindset, where you've got two groups of people, they're drunk and they're stupid, and they're facing off, and one guy's mouthing off. If the guy on the other side says, dude, you're being an asshole, the fight's on.
Mm-hmm.
Where if somebody from his side taps him on the shoulder and says, dude,
Right.
you're being an asshole,
Right.
he's receptive to that. So as allies who are viewed as being on their side,
Right.
or if you're a member of a church that there's a lot of people who have maybe a view that's 15, 20 years out of date,
Right.
it's not only possible for you to come forward and help out, it's more helpful
Right.
than some people who are more active in the community,
Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
they'll listen to you. You'll listen to people who you identify more closely with than the people who are on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, again, thank you so much, Myriam, for coming on today. We'll put that information in the show notes.
Sounds great.
And have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Bye.
Bye-bye. So.
Thank you for watching today. I hope you found something useful or maybe even inspiring. If you liked what you saw, please take a few minutes to subscribe, like, and comment. Those little things add up to big help for the channel. If you loved it, consider checking out our Facebook page for more family safety news and information. And think about supporting us on Patreon, where you'll get early access, monthly training resources, blooper footage, and other exclusive benefits. You'll find links to both in the show notes. Most of all, thank you for being part of the safest family on the block team. Stay safe, everybody. See you next time.